For those of you who have followed my channel for a while, you'll know that I usually cover several cases in one video. That was my original plan for this story too. But the more I researched what happened to Christopher Newsome and Channon Christian, the more I realized this case deserved to stand on its own. It's taken me a little longer than I expected to make this video because, if I'm honest, this is one of the most upsetting cases I have ever researched. It stayed with me long after I finished reading the case files, witness testimony, and court records. Even many of the experienced investigators who worked on this case have spoken about how it never left them. What happened to Chris and Channon over the final hours of their lives was almost beyond comprehension. Throughout this video, I won't be describing every graphic detail of the violence they endured. Not because it should be hidden, and certainly not because I want to minimize what happened to them, but because I believe the evidence, the forensic findings, the investigation, and the criminal charges speak far louder than any graphic description ever could. My goal has never been to sensationalize their suffering. It's to tell Chris and Channon's story with honesty, dignity, and compassion. Before they became victims, they were two young people deeply in love, with families who adored them, dreams they were working towards, and futures that should have stretched out for decades. This documentary isn't about glorifying the people who took those futures away. It's about remembering Christopher Newsome and Channon Christian, because after everything they endured, that's who deserves to be remembered. So, let's begin. On the evening of Saturday, January 6, 2007, 21-year-old Channon Christian and her 23-year-old boyfriend, Christopher Newsome, were looking forward to nothing more than a fun night with friends. The young couple were due to attend a close friend's birthday party in Knoxville, Tennessee. They were both outgoing, loved spending time with the people they cared about, and were only about an hour away from joining everyone else for what should have been an ordinary Saturday night. But they never arrived. As the evening wore on, calls to their mobile phones went unanswered. At first, their friends wondered if the couple had simply changed their plans or been delayed, but that wasn't like Chris and Channon. They weren't the sort of people to disappear without letting someone know, especially when friends were expecting them. Almost immediately, those closest to them sensed that something was terribly wrong. What nobody could have imagined was that, in those very moments, Chris and Channon were enduring an unimaginable nightmare. Less than 72 hours later, the truth would begin to emerge, shocking not only the city of Knoxville, but the entire state of Tennessee. The disappearance of two young people would become one of the most horrifying criminal cases in the state's history. A case remembered for its extraordinary cruelty, the courage of its victims, and the devastating impact it left on everyone who followed it. This is the story of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsome. To understand the enormity of what was taken away that January night, we first need to know who Channon Christian was. Channon Gail Christian was born on April 29, 1985, in Nacogdoches, Texas, to parents Gary and Dina Christian. She was the youngest of two children, growing up alongside her older brother, Chase. Her parents had once been told they would never be able to have children, making both Chase and Channon nothing short of miracles in their eyes. They were cherished from the very beginning, growing up in a home filled with love, encouragement, and unwavering support. When Channon was 12 years old, the family relocated to Knoxville, Tennessee, where she spent the rest of her childhood. It was a comfortable middle-class upbringing in a close-knit community where neighbors knew one another and friendships lasted for years. Family was at the center of everything, and Channon remained incredibly close to both of her parents throughout her life. She especially shared a remarkable bond with her mother, Dina. The two spoke every day, often several times a day, about everything from university life and work to hopes for the future. There were very few secrets between them. Dina wasn't just Channon's mother, she was one of her closest friends. Those who knew Channon described her as someone who had an infectious smile and a warmth that made people instantly feel comfortable around her. She was gentle, compassionate, and the sort of person others naturally gravitated towards. If a friend was struggling, Channon was usually the first person they called. She had a calm, thoughtful way of listening without judgment, and always tried to help people see a path forward. She was fascinated by people and what shaped their behavior. Wanting to understand the human mind and society better, she enrolled at university to study sociology, hoping one day to build a career helping others. Like many students eager to move away from home, Channon deliberately chose a university close enough that she could continue living with her parents. It wasn't because she lacked independence, quite the opposite. She simply treasured being close to her family and especially valued the time she spent with her mom. The pair often talked about the future Channon hoped to build. She dreamed of one day getting married, having a beautiful wedding, and raising 4 children when the time was right. They were ordinary dreams, but they were dreams she worked incredibly hard towards. Determined to make her own way in life, Channon balanced her university studies with 2 jobs, often juggling long days between lectures and work. She was proud of earning her own money and saving rather than relying on anyone else. After months of hard work, she finally achieved one of her biggest goals. She bought herself a silver Toyota 4Runner SUV. To most people, it was simply a vehicle. To Channon, it represented independence, determination, and everything she had worked so hard to achieve. She took enormous pride in it, knowing every payment and every mile had been earned through her own efforts. She had no way of knowing that, just a short time later, that same vehicle would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the investigation into her disappearance. Just like Channon, Christopher Newsome was deeply loved long before tragedy ever entered his story. Hugh Christopher Newsome Jr. was born on September 21, 1983, in Knoxville, Tennessee. His arrival came as a complete surprise to his parents. By then, his older siblings had already grown up and begun lives of their own, and they believed their days of raising children were behind them. Instead, they were given one final, unexpected gift. Although his first name was Hugh, everyone knew him simply as Christopher, or more commonly Chris. From the moment he woke each morning until his head finally hit the pillow at night, Chris was full of energy. He was curious, hardworking, and happiest when he was outdoors or building something with his own 2 hands. Sport quickly became one of his greatest passions. He excelled at baseball from a young age and later developed a love for golf, tennis, and fishing. Whether he was on a sports field, standing beside a lake with a fishing rod, or enjoying a day on the golf course with friends, Chris always seemed most at peace outside. He was equally talented as a craftsman. As a teenager, Chris developed a passion for woodworking, spending hours creating handmade gifts for family and friends. He briefly trained as a motorcycle mechanic because of his love of bikes, but it wasn't long before he realized where his true passion lay. Working with wood and creating something lasting with his own hands gave him a sense of purpose, so he chose to study carpentry professionally instead. But while Chris's talents were obvious, it was his character that people remembered most. He had an instinctive kindness that couldn't be taught. Friends recalled that if someone was sitting alone or being bullied at school, Chris would be the first person to walk over and start a conversation. He hated seeing people excluded and had a quiet way of making everyone feel like they belonged. One story in particular perfectly captured the kind of man he was. When a fellow student had no one to accompany her to the homecoming dance, Chris asked her to go with him so she wouldn't have to spend the evening alone. It wasn't about popularity or attention. It was simply who he was. Like Channon, he became the friend people turned to when life became difficult. Whether someone needed practical help, honest advice, or simply someone willing to listen, Chris was always there. In 2006, when Chris was 23 and Channon was 21, fate brought the 2 of them together. Their parents had met through mutual friends and thought the pair might get along. It turned out to be one of those rare introductions where everything just clicked. From the very beginning, they were inseparable. Friends noticed how naturally they fit together. Chris couldn't stop talking about Channon, and Channon spoke about Chris with the same excitement. It was obvious to everyone around them that they had found something special. Many of their dates were spent outdoors, doing the things they both loved most. One of their favorite pastimes was playing golf together. Channon had grown up around the sport, often following her father and brother around the course before eventually deciding to play herself. Now she and Chris would spend hours walking from hole to hole, laughing, talking, and making plans for the future. As the months passed, those plans became more serious. They spoke about one day getting married, raising a family, and building a life together. After only a few months of dating, Chris proudly introduced Channon to his parents, who immediately saw how happy she made their son. They believed the two brought out the very best in one another, and that they had a long, happy future ahead of them. Neither family could have imagined that future would be stolen in the most unimaginable way. On the evening of Saturday, January 6, 2007, Chris and Channon were looking forward to nothing more than a quiet dinner together before meeting friends for a birthday celebration later that evening. Earlier that night, Channon drove to the Washington Ridge apartments where one of her friends lived, so they could get ready together before the party. She packed a change of clothes into a bag, parked her silver Toyota 4Runner in the apartment complex's designated parking area, and spent the next hour chatting and getting ready with her friends. The plan was simple. Chris would pick Channon up from the apartments. The two would go out for dinner, and afterwards, they would join everyone else at the birthday party, arriving around 8 p.m. As Channon's friends left for the party, they waved goodbye and told her they would see her later. None of them realized it would be the last time they would ever see her alive. A short while later, Chris arrived. He was running behind after dropping one of his own friends at the very same party. During the drive over, he had apologized for being late, and although Channon was frustrated that their evening wasn't going quite as planned, neither of them stayed angry for long. After exchanging a few words, Channon climbed into the driver's seat of her Toyota, while Chris walked around to the driver's window. Leaning inside, he wrapped his arms around her in a warm embrace. It was a simple moment between two people deeply in love. Neither of them knew it would be the last act of kindness or comfort they would ever share. As they prepared to leave the apartment complex, armed men approached them. At gunpoint, Chris and Channon were forced into Channon's own vehicle. What had begun as an ordinary Saturday night instantly became a terrifying kidnapping. Like many victims in those first moments, they may have hoped they were being robbed, and that if they cooperated, they would eventually be released. Instead, they were taken away to face hours of unimaginable violence and suffering. The ordeal that followed would become one of the most horrifying crimes in Tennessee's history. The following morning, Sunday, January 7th, Dina Christian awoke with a feeling she couldn't explain. Something didn't feel right. When she checked Channon's bedroom, she realized her daughter had never come home the previous night as she had planned. Looking at her mobile phone, Dina noticed several missed calls from unfamiliar numbers. Before returning them, she first tried calling Channon herself. Every call went straight to voicemail. Her growing concern quickly turned into dread. When she finally returned one of the missed calls, it was answered immediately by one of Channon's friends from the birthday party. Within moments, Dina learned that Chris and Channon had never arrived. Their friends had spent the previous evening growing increasingly worried. The couple had been excited about the party and were never the type to disappear without letting somebody know. As phone calls and text messages went unanswered, everyone began to fear that something had happened. By around 11 p.m. the night before, two of Chris's friends decided to drive back to the Washington Ridge apartments. Chris's pickup truck was still sitting where he had left it, but Channon's silver Toyota 4Runner was gone. At that point, they knew something was terribly wrong. The couple had clearly left the apartment complex, but had never reached the restaurant or the birthday party. Friends immediately began contacting both families. Not long afterwards, Dina received another call. Channon had failed to arrive for work. It was then that the terrible feeling she'd woken with became impossible to ignore. She contacted Chris's parents, Hugh and Mary Newsome, and together the two families agreed it was time to report Chris and Channon missing. According to their families, when they contacted law enforcement, they were told they would need to wait before a formal missing persons report could be taken. It's worth pointing out here that there has never been a law in the United States requiring someone to wait 24 hours before reporting a missing person. While many missing adults are eventually found safe, every disappearance should be assessed on its own circumstances, and when loved ones know that someone's behavior is completely out of character, those concerns deserve to be taken seriously from the very beginning. Refusing to wait, Chris and Channon's families began searching for themselves. They returned to the Washington Ridge apartments, contacted friends and relatives, telephoned hospitals throughout the area, organized a phone tree, and followed every lead they could think of. As the hours passed, their desperation grew. What they didn't know was that elsewhere in Knoxville, a devastating discovery had already been made. Shortly after midday on Sunday, January 7th, a railroad employee discovered the burned body of a young man lying beside railroad tracks. The condition of the body made identification impossible at the scene. Yet, one feature remained hauntingly recognizable: his bright blue eyes. Investigators removed the body for examination, hoping to identify the victim and determine exactly what had happened. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the discovery, Chris and Channon's families continued searching across Knoxville, still clinging to the hope that someone somewhere had seen them alive. As Chris and Channon's families continued searching across Knoxville, they refused to give up hope. Desperate for anything that might point them in the right direction, they persuaded Channon's mobile phone provider to release her phone records and the last available location data. The records showed that her phone had most recently connected to a cell tower near Cherry Street, approximately 6 miles from the Washington Ridge apartments. It wasn't much to go on, but it was the first real lead they had. The families immediately shifted their search to the Cherry Street area. Locals knew it as a neighborhood with a high crime rate, somewhere most people avoided unless they lived there or had a specific reason to visit. Then, at around 2 a.m. on Monday, January 8th, just over 24 hours after Chris and Channon had vanished, the search took a devastating turn. Channon's silver Toyota 4Runner was found abandoned on Cherry Street. The moment her family looked inside, they knew something was terribly wrong. The vehicle that Channon had worked so hard to buy no longer looked like hers. The personal touches that made it unmistakably Channon's had disappeared. The stickers had been removed from the windows. The teddy bear and photographs she kept on the dashboard were gone. Her iPod, which she always kept in the vehicle for music, had vanished, along with her phone charger. It appeared that someone had deliberately tried to erase every trace of her. There was more. The driver's seat had been pushed so far back that Channon, who was considerably shorter, would not have been able to reach the pedals. A packet of cigarettes sat between the front seats, despite neither Chris nor Channon smoking. Mud covered the footwells of the vehicle. Those details may have seemed small in isolation, but to the people who knew Channon best, they spoke volumes. She took enormous pride in keeping her 4Runner spotless, and they knew she would never have left it in that condition. Their worst fears were becoming reality. The families contacted police once again. This time the investigation began in earnest, and Channon's Toyota was taken away for forensic examination. But elsewhere in Knoxville, investigators were already uncovering another heartbreaking part of the story. The body discovered beside the railroad tracks was beginning to reveal its own evidence. Investigators found that the young man had been wrapped in a comforter, with a sweatshirt tied around his head. He had no shoes, and the mud still clinging to his feet suggested he had been on the ground before his death. The post-mortem examination revealed that he had sustained multiple gunshot wounds to the head, neck, and torso. The examination also found evidence that Chris had been sexually assaulted before he was killed. Because of the extensive fire damage inflicted after his death, investigators were unable to recover usable DNA from that evidence. Within hours, the victim was formally identified as 23-year-old Christopher Newsome. For Hugh and Mary Newsome, every hope that their son might still be alive vanished in an instant. The injuries caused by the fire were so severe that investigators advised them not to view Chris's remains. Instead, the last time they saw their beloved son was as he was carried away inside a body bag. No parent should ever have to say goodbye like that. While the Newsome family faced the unimaginable reality that Chris had been murdered, one agonizing question remained unanswered. Where was Channon? And was there still any chance that she could be found alive? With the confirmation that the body found beside the railroad tracks was Christopher Newsome, both families were forced to confront the reality they had prayed would never come. Chris wasn't coming home. The grief was overwhelming, but there was still one desperate hope left to cling to. Channon had not yet been found. Investigators now shifted every available resource towards locating her as quickly as possible. At the same time, forensic officers began carrying out a meticulous examination of Channon's abandoned Toyota 4Runner, searching for anything that might identify the people responsible, and more importantly, lead them to Channon before it was too late. One seemingly ordinary item would change the entire investigation. Tucked between the seats was an envelope bearing a handwritten address, 2316 Chipman Street. The address immediately caught investigators' attention. Even more significant were the fingerprints recovered from the envelope. They were quickly identified as belonging to Lamarcus Davidson, a man whose listed address matched the very same Chipman Street property. A background check revealed that Davidson had only recently been released from prison after serving approximately 5 years for convictions including carjacking and aggravated robbery. Suddenly, investigators had their first real suspect. Yet one question continued to trouble them. How had two young people from completely different walks of life ended up connected to a man with such a violent criminal history? Everything suggested that Chris and Channon hadn't known him at all. Whatever had happened on the evening of January 6th appeared to have been a chance encounter, one that had spiraled into an unimaginable nightmare. For investigators, there was no longer any time to lose. On Tuesday, January 9th, officers traveled to the address on the envelope. The property at 2316 Chipman Street stood in a rundown area, largely surrounded by industrial buildings, with only a handful of homes scattered along the street. It looked unremarkable. Nothing about the small rental house hinted at the horrors investigators were about to uncover inside. Officers approached cautiously and knocked on the front door. There was no response. Given the evidence already linking the address to the investigation, and believing there was a possibility that Channon could still be inside, they decided to force entry. What they discovered beyond that door would leave even experienced investigators shaken, and would reveal the true scale of the nightmare Chris and Channon had endured. What investigators discovered inside 2316 Chipman Street would reveal a crime so horrific that many of the officers who entered the house would later admit they never truly forgot what they saw. Almost immediately, they began finding items that confirmed Chris and Channon had both been there. Channon's missing iPod was recovered, along with the shoes she had been wearing on the night she disappeared. Officers also found Chris's baseball cap, the same one witnesses had last seen him wearing, as well as his driver's license. There was no longer any doubt. This house had become the center of the investigation. Then the search moved into the kitchen. Sitting inside a rubbish bin was a dirty white sheet, covering a large bundle wrapped in black plastic bags. As investigators carefully cut through the layers, the horrifying truth was revealed. Inside were the remains of 21-year-old Channon Christian. After everything she had endured, she had been discarded as though her life had meant nothing. The discovery devastated everyone involved. The house was immediately sealed as a major crime scene, while Channon's family received the news they had desperately prayed they would never hear. Their daughter was gone. As with Christopher Newsome, the post-mortem examination would reveal that Channon's death had not been the result of a sudden attack. The evidence documented a prolonged ordeal of violence, repeated sexual assaults, and unimaginable suffering before she was finally killed. But unlike Chris, whose body had been deliberately burned in an apparent attempt to destroy forensic evidence, Channon's body still held the answers investigators desperately needed. Those responsible had tried to conceal what they had done. Investigators would later learn that bleach had been poured over Channon's body in an apparent attempt to destroy DNA evidence. Her killers had also stripped her vehicle of personal belongings, removed identifying items, concealed her body inside the house, and attempted to clean parts of the crime scene. It was a calculated effort to erase every trace of the crimes they had committed. But they had made one crucial mistake. They underestimated forensic science. Despite everything they had done to cover their tracks, investigators recovered biological evidence from Channon's body and clothing. Fingerprints were lifted from the plastic bags in which she had been concealed, from inside the house itself, and from the envelope recovered inside Channon's abandoned Toyota 4Runner. Every one of those fingerprints pointed to the same man, Lamarcus Davidson. Investigators also recovered spent shell casings from inside the house. Ballistics testing would later confirm they matched the weapon used to murder Christopher Newsome, linking the Chipman Street house directly to both killings. The offenders had believed they had erased the evidence. Instead, they had left investigators a roadmap. Every fingerprint, every shell casing, every biological sample, every abandoned possession, each one silently told another part of Chris and Channon's story. As forensic scientists continued processing DNA evidence, detectives launched an urgent manhunt for Lamarcus Davidson. At that moment, investigators believed they were hunting one killer. They had no idea they were about to uncover something even more disturbing. One person had not attacked Chris and Channon. They had been attacked by several. As detectives analyzed Davidson's mobile phone records, they identified repeated contact with another man, Eric Boyd. A bolo, "Be on the lookout," was issued. Later that same day, officers stopped a vehicle being driven by Boyd. Initially, he claimed he didn't know Lamarcus Davidson. But as detectives confronted him with the seriousness of the investigation, his story quickly changed. According to investigators, Boyd told officers he had no intention of taking responsibility for crimes committed by someone else. He then directed them to a vacant house that he said Davidson was using as a hiding place, a property that happened to be for sale, and which, according to Boyd, they had burglarized days earlier. Officers surrounded the address before making entry. Inside, they found clear signs that someone had been staying there. Empty food containers, discarded rubbish, clothing, a mobile phone, binoculars, and a handgun were scattered throughout the house. Amongst the debris, officers found Lamarcus Davidson. He was arrested without further incident and taken into custody for questioning. Investigators also noted that, at the time of his arrest, Davidson was wearing a pair of Nike trainers that had belonged to Christopher Newsome. For Chris's family, it was another painful reminder that even after taking his life, those responsible had continued to strip away his belongings as though they were trophies. The arrest marked a significant breakthrough, but detectives were about to discover that Davidson was only one part of a far larger and far more disturbing picture. Following his arrest, Lamarcus Davidson was taken to police headquarters for questioning. Detectives hoped they were finally about to learn what had happened to Chris and Channon. Instead, they were met with a wall of lies. Over the next several hours, Davidson changed his story again and again, offering investigators no fewer than 5 different versions of events. Each account contradicted the last, and with every interview, it became increasingly clear that he was trying to minimize his own role while shifting responsibility onto everyone else. At first, Davidson claimed he knew nothing about either victim and insisted he had not even been at the Chipman Street house. When detectives confronted him with the growing mountain of forensic evidence, his story changed. He then claimed that 2 men had arrived at the house after carjacking a young couple, and that Chris and Channon had already been tied up in the back of their own vehicle when they arrived. According to Davidson, he wanted no part in what was happening and left the house to smoke marijuana nearby. He claimed that when he returned around 20 minutes later, Christopher Newsome had disappeared. Channon, however, was still inside the house. Davidson admitted seeing her tied up in the living room and claimed she pleaded with him, telling him she didn't want to die. Even then, he insisted he had done nothing to help her. Instead, he admitted taking Channon's Toyota 4Runner to sell drugs around Knoxville before wiping it down and abandoning it on Cherry Street. He denied sexually assaulting Channon and denied any involvement in her murder. Instead, he pointed the finger at two people he knew well, his half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, and his close friend, George Thomas. By now, detectives had heard enough. The forensic evidence was beginning to paint a picture far more reliable than any of the stories Davidson was telling. On January 11th, investigators arrested Latalvis Cobbins and George Thomas on suspicion of murdering Christopher Newsome and Channon Christian. Eric Boyd, who investigators believed had helped Davidson after the murders by assisting him while knowing what had happened, was also arrested. But the investigation wasn't over. During questioning, the suspects revealed there had been another person inside the Chipman Street house, an 18-year-old woman named Vanessa Coleman. She, too, was arrested later that day. For the first time since Chris and Channon disappeared, every known person believed to have been involved was in police custody. Only then did investigators begin piecing together what had happened inside the house on Chipman Street. None of the suspects was willing to tell the whole truth. Each blamed someone else. Each attempted to minimize their own role, and each hoped the evidence would point the finger elsewhere. But forensic evidence doesn't lie. As detectives compared the suspects' statements against fingerprints, DNA, phone records, ballistics, and witness testimony, a far clearer picture began to emerge. Investigators came to believe that Lamarcus Davidson had been the driving force behind the crimes. According to the evidence, the motive had begun with something as simple and as senseless as stealing a vehicle to use in his drug operation. By chance, Chris and Channon had crossed paths with him at exactly the wrong moment. Latalvis Cobbins would eventually provide detectives with the first account that broadly matched the physical evidence. He told investigators that he, Davidson, and Eric Boyd had driven to the Washington Ridge apartments because one of them intended to meet a woman there. As they entered the car park, they noticed Channon's silver Toyota 4Runner. Inside sat Channon. Standing beside the driver's window was Chris, embracing her before the couple left for their evening together. It was a moment of pure normality, a young couple saying goodbye to a minor disagreement and looking forward to dinner with friends. Seconds later, according to investigators, that ordinary moment was shattered. Armed men rushed towards them. Chris and Channon were held at gunpoint and forced into Channon's own vehicle. What had started as a carjacking would quickly become something far more sinister. And over the coming hours, Chris and Channon would endure a level of cruelty that shocked even the seasoned detectives tasked with uncovering the truth. The physical evidence was dismantling every attempt to deny responsibility. Vanessa Coleman also denied willingly participating in the crimes. She admitted she had been inside the house, but claimed she, too, had been effectively held against her will and was too frightened to intervene. Investigators carefully examined that account alongside the forensic evidence and witness testimony as they reconstructed the events inside the house. Piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. Investigators concluded that after Chris and Channon were abducted at gunpoint from the Washington Ridge apartments, they were driven to 2316 Chipman Street, where both were restrained and separated. What followed over the next several hours was a sustained ordeal of physical and sexual violence, unlike anything many of the detectives had encountered during their careers. Chris and Channon were repeatedly terrorized, assaulted, and humiliated by multiple offenders. While Christopher Newsome was being taken away from the house, Channon Christian remained captive inside 2316 Chipman Street. She had no way of knowing what had happened to Chris, but the evidence would later show one thing beyond any doubt. She never stopped fighting to survive. Even after enduring hours of captivity, Channon continued to resist her attackers. Rather than showing mercy, her determination appeared only to fuel their violence. According to the forensic evidence and testimony presented during the investigation, after Christopher was murdered, the offenders returned their attention to Channon. What followed was a prolonged and sustained assault of extraordinary brutality. Over many hours, Channon was repeatedly beaten, sexually assaulted, restrained, and subjected to unimaginable physical and psychological abuse. The injuries documented during her post-mortem examination demonstrated that this was not a sudden act of violence, but a deliberate campaign of torture carried out over an extended period. Experienced investigators, forensic specialists, and prosecutors would later describe the evidence as among the most disturbing they had encountered during their careers. Yet even after everything Channon had endured, those responsible still weren't thinking about her suffering. They were thinking about themselves. Realizing the evidence left on Channon's body could identify every person involved, they began trying to erase it. Investigators concluded that bleach had been poured over Channon's body and into her mouth in an apparent attempt to destroy DNA evidence. Areas of obvious injury were scrubbed in an effort to remove any trace that could link the offenders to the crimes they had committed. It was a calculated attempt to cover their tracks. Just as they had burned Christopher's body and abandoned Channon's vehicle after removing many of her personal belongings, they believed this final act would eliminate the evidence needed to identify them. They were wrong. Despite everything they did, investigators recovered crucial forensic evidence from Channon's body, her clothing, the house itself, and the items left behind at the scene. Once again, every attempt to destroy the truth only left investigators with more pieces of the puzzle. Eventually, believing they had done enough to conceal their crimes, the offenders bound Channon, placed a plastic bag over her head, and concealed her inside multiple rubbish bags before leaving her inside a kitchen bin beneath old sheets. The medical examiner later concluded that Channon died from asphyxiation. She was just 21 years old. Her post-mortem examination documented extensive injuries consistent with prolonged torture and repeated sexual violence. The medical examiner would later describe the sexual assault as exceptionally severe, reflecting the extraordinary cruelty inflicted during Channon's final hours. While Channon lay dying inside the house, those responsible carried on with their day as though nothing had happened. Lamarcus Davidson left the property wearing Christopher Newsome's Nike trainers. Using Christopher's mobile phone, he visited his girlfriend and even gave her some of Channon's personal belongings. It was yet another reminder of the complete disregard the offenders had shown for the lives they had destroyed. When investigators later searched Vanessa Coleman's home, they recovered a journal containing an entry written on January 9, 2007, the day after Chris and Channon's ordeal had come to an end. In it she wrote, "Last night was one of a kind. Let's talk about adventures. I had one hell of an adventure since I've been in the Big TN. It's a crazy world these days, but I love the fun adventures and lessons that I've learned. It's going to be a long, interesting year." To investigators and to the families of Chris and Channon, those words were almost impossible to comprehend. While two innocent young people had been subjected to unimaginable suffering, one of the people accused of being present described it simply as one hell of an adventure. It was a sentence that would come to symbolize not only the cruelty of the crimes themselves, but also the complete absence of compassion shown by those responsible. With every suspect now in custody and an overwhelming amount of forensic evidence connecting them to the crimes, investigators had finally uncovered the truth of what had happened to Chris and Channon. Now came the next challenge, proving it in court. A Knox County grand jury returned an extraordinary number of indictments. Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, and George Thomas were each charged with multiple offenses, including first-degree murder, felony murder, especially aggravated kidnapping, especially aggravated robbery, aggravated rape, and theft, reflecting the sheer scale and brutality of the crimes investigators believed they had committed. Vanessa Coleman was also indicted on numerous charges, including felony murder, first-degree murder in relation to Channon, especially aggravated kidnapping, aggravated rape, robbery, and theft. Eric Boyd faced a different set of allegations. Investigators believed he had not participated in the initial abduction or the murders themselves, but had knowingly assisted those responsible afterwards by helping them evade capture. He was charged with being an accessory after the fact and with offenses relating to the carjacking and concealment of the crimes. For Chris and Channon's families, it should have been the moment they had been waiting for. Every person investigators believed had played a role was finally behind bars. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprints, the DNA, the ballistics, the mobile phone records, the property recovered from the suspects. It seemed impossible that anyone responsible could escape justice. But the legal battle was only just beginning. Rather than bringing immediate closure, the case became tied up in years of hearings, legal motions, and procedural delays. It would be almost 2 years before the first trials finally began. During that time, defense attorneys argued that the intense media coverage surrounding the case had made it impossible for their clients to receive a fair trial in Knoxville. Judge Richard Baumgartner agreed that some precautions were necessary. To reduce the risk of jury bias, jurors for the trials of George Thomas and Latalvis Cobbins were selected from neighboring Davidson County rather than Knox County. Numerous additional motions were filed, including repeated requests to move the trials or dismiss aspects of the prosecution's case. While lawyers debated legal technicalities inside the courtroom, Chris and Channon's families were living a very different reality. Every hearing forced them to relive the evidence. Every delay meant waiting even longer for accountability. Every motion reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Eventually, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty against several of the principal defendants, reflecting the extraordinary brutality of the crimes and the aggravating factors they believed the evidence would establish. The proceedings were often highly emotional. On one occasion, Judge Baumgartner warned members of Christopher Newsome's family that they could be removed from the courtroom after an outburst directed at one of the defense attorneys. Given everything the families had learned about Chris and Channon's final hours, it's perhaps unsurprising that emotions sometimes became impossible to contain. But if the evidence itself had been harrowing, the arguments some defense lawyers would soon present to the jury would prove equally difficult for the families to sit through. The first person to stand trial was Eric Boyd. Unlike the others, Boyd was not charged with murder. Prosecutors argued that while he had not directly participated in the killings, he had knowingly assisted those responsible afterwards by helping them evade capture. His defense maintained that he had only learned about Chris and Channon's murders after they had already taken place, and therefore bore no responsibility for the crimes themselves. The jury disagreed. Eric Boyd was convicted and sentenced to the maximum 18 years in prison. The trials of Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, and George Thomas followed. For Chris and Channon's families, they would prove to be every bit as traumatic as the murders themselves. Rather than accepting responsibility, each defendant attempted to distance himself from the crimes, shifting blame onto the others, and offering conflicting accounts that were repeatedly contradicted by the forensic evidence. Perhaps the most distressing aspect of the trials, however, was the strategy adopted by the defense. Despite the overwhelming physical evidence documenting prolonged violence and repeated sexual assaults, the defense argued that Chris and Channon had voluntarily gone to the Chipman Street house to buy drugs, and that Channon had willingly engaged in sexual activity with the defendants before events spiraled out of control. It was a claim that prosecutors described as being completely unsupported by the evidence. Toxicology testing found no drugs in Channon's system. Christopher's toxicology results showed evidence of occasional marijuana use, but nothing that supported the suggestion that the couple had traveled to Chipman Street to purchase drugs that evening. Far more compelling was the forensic evidence. The injuries documented during Channon's post-mortem examination demonstrated prolonged torture and repeated sexual violence. DNA recovered from her body and clothing, fingerprints throughout the house, ballistics evidence, phone records, and the suspect's own contradictory statements combined to present a picture that was impossible to ignore. The prosecution argued that the evidence spoke for itself. The juries agreed. One by one, guilty verdicts were returned. Latalvis Cobbins was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. George Thomas also received life imprisonment without parole. Lamarcus Davidson was sentenced to death for the murders, along with an additional 80 years for the associated offenses. During sentencing, Judge Richard Baumgartner struggled to find words that reflected the enormity of what had happened. He described the crimes as one of the most incredibly outrageous, cruel, and inhumane cases this court has ever seen. How people can engage in this type of conduct is simply unexplainable. There really is no sentence great enough to punish you for the conduct you have been convicted of. For Chris and Channon's families, the guilty verdicts brought accountability, but they could never bring back the two young people whose futures had been stolen. The trials were over, but the grief would remain for the rest of their lives. For many people, guilty verdicts marked the end of a criminal case. For Chris and Channon's families, they were only the beginning of another painful chapter. The final defendant, Vanessa Coleman, reached an agreement with prosecutors that granted her immunity from prosecution for the initial carjacking in exchange for her testimony against the other defendants. Importantly, that agreement did not extend to the far more serious allegations of murder and rape. When Vanessa eventually stood trial in 2010, she was acquitted of first-degree murder, but convicted of a number of lesser offenses, including facilitating the crimes committed inside the Chipman Street house. She was sentenced to 53 years in prison. Throughout every hearing and every trial, Chris and Channon's families sat in the courtroom, forced to relive the events of January 2007 over and over again. During Vanessa's sentencing, Channon's father, Gary Christian, delivered a victim impact statement that captured the true cost of what had been taken from his family. He said, "For me personally, you took my baby. You took my opportunity to say yes to a young man one day. You took my wedding dance away. You took my opportunity to hold her child, my grandbaby." Those words weren't about court proceedings. They weren't about prison sentences. They were about an entire future that had been stolen. For a brief moment, it seemed the legal process was finally coming to an end. Then everything changed. As happens in many major criminal cases, each of the defendants appealed their convictions. That in itself wasn't unusual. What happened next, however, stunned the entire state of Tennessee. In 2011, Judge Richard Baumgartner, the very judge who had presided over the trials, was forced to resign after it emerged that he had engaged in serious professional misconduct. Investigators discovered that Baumgartner had developed an addiction to prescription medication and had been obtaining drugs through improper channels, including from individuals connected to the criminal justice system. He later admitted to official misconduct and was removed from the bench before eventually being disbarred. The revelations cast doubt over several cases he had overseen. Almost overnight, convictions that Chris and Channon's families believed had finally brought justice were thrown into uncertainty. Among those affected were the convictions of Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, and Vanessa Coleman. For the families, it was another devastating blow. After everything they had already endured, there was now a real possibility they would have to sit through new trials and hear every painful detail all over again. Fortunately, after a series of appeals, the courts ultimately ruled that Lamarcus Davidson and Latalvis Cobbins would not receive new trials. George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman, however, were granted new proceedings. Even then, the evidence remained overwhelming. Vanessa was once again convicted of the offenses against her, although her sentence was reduced from 53 years to 35 years. George Thomas was also convicted again. His sentence was modified from life imprisonment without the possibility of parole to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 51 years. Further appeals were pursued for years afterwards, reaching as far as the Supreme Court of the United States. Each one was ultimately unsuccessful. Time and again, the convictions were upheld. Despite years of legal challenges, the evidence that Chris and Channon had unknowingly left behind continued to withstand every attempt to unravel the case. The truth had survived once again. Just when it appeared that the years of appeals were finally drawing to a close, the case took yet another unexpected turn. As George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman prepared for their retrials, investigators heard fresh testimony that raised serious questions about Eric Boyd's involvement. During the original proceedings, Boyd had maintained that he had only become involved after the murders, helping those responsible evade capture, but playing no direct role in the abduction or killings themselves. The new evidence suggested otherwise. As witnesses were re-interviewed and testimony was revisited, investigators came to believe that Boyd's involvement had been far greater than originally understood. As a result, a new indictment was returned against him. This time, Eric Boyd faced 36 additional charges, including first-degree felony murder, first-degree premeditated murder, especially aggravated robbery, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. More than a decade after Chris and Channon were murdered, Boyd once again found himself standing before a jury. His 2019 trial would prove to be another pivotal moment in the case. One of the prosecution's key witnesses was George Thomas, who agreed to testify about Boyd's involvement as part of an agreement reached with prosecutors following his own retrial. Once again, the forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the events reconstructed by investigators painted a compelling picture of what had happened inside the Chipman Street house. The jury found Eric Boyd guilty on almost all of the new charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, along with an additional 90 years for the associated offenses. Since then, Boyd has challenged his convictions through multiple appeals. Each has been unsuccessful. Meanwhile, questions also remained over the future of Vanessa Coleman. Under the terms of her sentence, she first became eligible for parole in 2014 after serving 7 years in prison. For Chris and Channon's families, the possibility of any of those involved one day walking free was deeply painful. Twice, parole boards have considered Coleman's release. Twice they have refused. Most recently, in 2020, the parole board denied her release once again, ruling that she would not be considered for parole again until 2030. For the families, it was another reminder that although the criminal trials had long since ended, the pursuit of justice never truly does. Every appeal, every parole hearing, every legal challenge reopens wounds that can never fully heal. For Chris and Channon's loved ones, January 2007 wasn't simply a chapter in the past. It became something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Even after the trials had ended, Chris and Channon's story continued to generate debate across the United States. In the months and years that followed, some commentators claimed the case had not received the level of national media coverage it deserved because Chris and Channon were white and the offenders were black. As those discussions spread online, several websites and blogs also began publishing false and exaggerated claims about the murders, including fabricated details about what had been done to the victims. Those claims were then used by various groups to support their own political and ideological agendas. 2 rallies organized by white supremacist groups even attempted to use Chris and Channon's murders as evidence for their own beliefs, while some commentators made deeply offensive claims about the victims and their families. The Knoxville Police Department rejected suggestions that the investigation had treated the case as a racially motivated attack, stating that investigators found no evidence the couple had been targeted because of their race. According to the investigation, Chris and Channon were the victims of an opportunistic and extraordinarily violent carjacking that escalated into kidnapping, torture, and murder. Perhaps the most important voices in that discussion, however, belonged to Chris and Channon's families. Although they believed anyone capable of committing such horrific crimes must have held profound hatred towards their children, they repeatedly asked that Chris and Channon's murders not be exploited to advance anyone else's political or racial agenda. As Channon's father, Gary Christian, so powerfully said, "The crime ain't about you." In many ways, those 5 words say everything that needs to be said. This case was never about politics, it was never about internet rumors, and it was never about giving a platform to extremists. It was and always will be about 2 young people whose lives, dreams, and futures were stolen on an ordinary Saturday night in January 2007. In the years since Christopher Newsome and Channon Christian were taken from their families, the house on Chipman Street where they endured their final hours has been demolished. In its place now stands a memorial, a quiet reminder that although evil briefly occupied that address, it does not define it. Christopher and Channon's names live on in a far different way. Scholarships and charitable foundations have been established in their honor, helping young people pursue the same opportunities that were stolen from them. At the University of Tennessee, where Channon was only months away from graduating with her sociology degree, her legacy continues to inspire students who, like her, hope to make a positive difference in others' lives. But no memorial, no scholarship, no sentence handed down by a judge could ever replace what was taken from two loving families. Christopher Newsome was just 23 years old. He loved baseball, fishing, and spending time outdoors. He had found his passion in carpentry, creating things with his own hands, and those who knew him remembered a young man whose kindness came as naturally as breathing. He was the friend who stood beside people when no one else would, the son who made his parents proud, and the man who had begun imagining a future with the woman he loved. Channon Christian was only 21. She was intelligent, compassionate, and determined to build a life helping others. She had chosen sociology because she wanted to better understand people and hoped one day to use that knowledge to make a real difference in the world. She dreamed of getting married, of dancing with her father on her wedding day, and of raising 4 children of her own. But those dreams were never realized. Instead, 2 ordinary young people who should have had decades of birthdays, holidays, weddings, and family celebrations ahead of them had their futures stolen over the course of a single weekend. Throughout this video, we've spoken about the investigation, the forensic evidence, the trials, and the appeals, but this story was never really about the people who committed these crimes. They don't deserve to be remembered for what they did. This story has always been about Chris and Channon. It's about 2 lives that mattered, 2 families whose worlds were shattered, 2 young people who deserved so much more than the cruelty they experienced during their final hours. Their story is difficult to hear because it forces us to confront the very worst of humanity. But it also reminds us of something else. Despite every attempt to silence them, despite the fire, despite the bleach, despite the lies, despite the countless attempts to destroy evidence and escape justice, the truth endured. Chris and Channon never had the opportunity to tell investigators what happened inside that house. Instead, the fingerprints spoke, the DNA spoke, the phone records spoke, the ballistics spoke, the forensic evidence spoke, and because of that, every single person responsible was held accountable. If there is one thing I hope people take away from this video, it isn't the names of the offenders. I hope you remember Christopher Newsome. I hope you remember Channon Christian. I hope you remember Chris's kindness, Channon's compassion, the futures they should have had, and the countless lives they would almost certainly have touched had they been given the chance. My heart goes out to both of their families, their friends, and everyone who loved them. Thank you for staying with their story. Rest peacefully, Chris. Rest peacefully, Channon. You will never be forgotten.